It was a brisk Wednesday afternoon, and the memory is still fresh in my mind. For a few weeks I'd been grappling with a leaky kitchen sink. What began as a minor drip had escalated into a significant problem. Eventually, I decided it was time to call in a plumber to assess the situation. His name was Ethan. I hadn't encountered him before, but I'd heard he was quite skilled, so I anticipated a straightforward solution. When he showed up, I opened the door and felt a wave of surprise. He looked much younger than I had imagined, likely in his late 30s or early 40s, and he was quite attractive, tall and with a strong build, broad shoulders adding to his appeal. I greeted him warmly and led him to the kitchen where the leak was. Admittedly, I had put on a nice robe that morning. It wasn't revealing, just something light and comfortable. However, when I caught Ethan stealing a glance at me, I felt a little spark as he began working under the sink. I found myself standing nearby, watching him intently. I couldn't explain why, but there was something about him that drew me in. Perhaps it was the way he moved with such confidence. Or maybe it was simply that I hadn't had company in a while. Whatever it was, I felt a stirring within me. I started to chat with him, asking about his day and how long he had been in plumbing. He responded politely, though he barely looked up at me, and I noticed a hint of nervousness in his voice as he tried to concentrate on his work rather than on me. It was endearing, really, and I couldn't help but smile. At one point, I reached out and lightly squeezed his shoulder. It was an innocent gesture, yet I sensed him tense up beneath my touch. "You're really strong," I complimented him, even though I could tell he was feeling a bit awkward. He looked up, startled, but I returned his gaze with a gentle smile. He shifted slightly, attempting to create some distance, but I wasn't ready to let go just yet. I moved a little closer, feigning interest in what he was doing. "Do you need any help?" I asked, fully aware that he didn't. I adjusted my robe slightly, allowing it to slip a bit off my shoulder. Ethan didn't reply, but I noticed a flush creep across his face as he focused intently on the pipes under the sink. I leaned down beside him, my hand brushing against his arm. He tensed again, but I stayed put. There was an undeniable electricity in the air, and I knew he felt it too. I stood up, slowly inching even closer to him. He remained crouched beneath the sink, doing his utmost to ignore the palpable tension between us, but I was determined not to let it dissipate easily. I waited for him to rise and gather his tools, and that's when I decided to make my move. I leaned in close enough for him to feel my breath on his neck. "Is there anything else you could assist me with?" I asked, my voice soft yet laced with a hint of urgency. He looked at me wide-eyed, initially at a loss for words. It was evident he was trying to figure out how to respond, so I gave him a little nudge. I let my hand glide down his arm, providing just enough contact to signal my intentions. Without waiting for a verbal reply, I leaned in and kissed him softly on the cheek. It wasn't a bold move at first, just a gentle kiss. But I could sense him freeze, and I knew I had crossed a line. He stood up abruptly, nearly bumping into the cabinets, and I saw the panic flash in his eyes. "Ma'am, I'm just here to fix the sink," he stammered, his voice shaky. I couldn't help but chuckle softly. "Are you sure there's nothing else that needs fixing?" I teased, stepping closer once more, my lips just inches from his. I could see the conflict on his face as he wrestled with the decision of whether to stay or flee. His hands trembled as he tried to hurriedly pack up his tools. "There's something else you could help me with," I whispered, leaning in as if I were about to kiss him again. But before I could, he stepped back, his hands raised defensively as if to ward me off. "I can't," he said, shaking his head. "I really can't." I pouted slightly, feeling a twinge of disappointment, but I understood he wasn't about to give in. Flustered, he hurriedly packed up his things, and I watched him go, a thrill coursing through me from our encounter. I hadn't anticipated him reacting this way, but pushing his boundaries had been exhilarating. Perhaps next time, who knows? I let him leave that day, but there was something about the way he exited. It wasn't just the awkwardness of the moment. A tension lingered in the air. I realized that while Ethan had said no, it wasn't because he wasn't intrigued. It felt like he was holding back, caught between the desire to do the right thing and the urge to give in. I could see it in his eyes, the hesitation before he left. It was as if he wanted to stay but didn't trust himself to navigate the situation. Days slipped by, and thoughts of him occupied my mind relentlessly. Every time I passed the sink, I recalled how flustered Ethan had become when I brushed his arm, or how his breathing shifted when I kissed his cheek. It was thrilling. It had been far too long since I felt that kind of excitement with anyone, especially someone younger. Honestly, I didn't expect to see him again. I figured he'd convinced himself to steer clear after our last encounter. Then about a week later my phone rang. The number was unfamiliar, but when I picked up, it turned out to be Ethan. "Hi, this is Ethan, the plumber. I just wanted to check in and see if everything's okay with the sink. Did the repair hold up?" His tone was polite and professional, but I could hear a slight tremor in his voice. I couldn't help but smile to myself. "Oh, Ethan, how thoughtful of you to call," I said, keeping my voice casual, fully aware of the implications. "Funny you should mention it. The sink is fine, but there's a small problem in the bathroom that I was hoping you could take a look at. It's probably nothing serious, but I wouldn't feel comfortable without a professional checking it out." There was a brief pause, and I could almost hear him weighing the pros and cons of returning. "I can be there in about an hour," he finally responded. Once I hung up, I felt a rush of exhilaration. This time I had every intention of making the most of the situation. I was sure he felt something between us even if he was trying to ignore it, and I was resolved to push the boundaries further this time. When Ethan arrived, he seemed noticeably more anxious than the first time. Although his usual confidence lingered, I sensed a hesitation as he entered the bathroom. He glanced around, appearing to search for something to focus on besides me. I guided him upstairs where I showed him the faucet issue. While it wasn't leaking, the handle had become loose. He knelt down to inspect it, concentrating entirely on his work, yet I could tell he was acutely aware of my presence. I stood just behind him, observing quietly as he worked, savoring the heavy silence thick with unspoken tension. Finally, I couldn't resist any longer. "Ethan," I said softly, "you've been on my mind." He paused, tightening his grip on the faucet. "You have." His voice was cautious, as if he was unsure whether to acknowledge our previous encounter. "I can't stop thinking about what happened the last time," I continued, stepping a little closer. "You seemed interested, but you held back. Why was that?" He hesitated, his knuckles turning white as he focused on the faucet. "It's just, I'm a professional," he murmured, his voice barely above a whisper. "It wouldn't be right, would it?" I asked, moving in so close that I could feel his warmth. "Who defines what's right or wrong, Ethan? We're both adults and we both know there's something between us. You can feel it, can't you?" I watched him closely, waiting for his reaction. I noticed his breathing quickened and his hands trembled slightly as he finished tightening the handle. He stood up, facing me, and I could see the internal conflict in his eyes. He was trying hard to maintain his professionalism to keep a distance, but I could tell he was struggling. "You don't have to resist," I whispered, inching closer, my hand lightly grazing his chest. I could feel his heart racing beneath my fingertips. "No one has to know. It's just you and me here." He looked down at me, jaw clenched, and for a fleeting moment I thought he might actually back away. But then, without warning, he reached out and took hold of my arm, drawing me toward him. The motion wasn't harsh, but it was firm, and the suddenness caught me off guard. Our faces were mere inches apart now, his breath warm against my skin. "Lila," he said, his voice low and intense, "this isn't a game." "I never claimed it was," I replied, a smile creeping onto my lips. The tension between us was palpable, crackling like static electricity. But it doesn't have to be complicated. Sometimes you just need to let go. He hesitated for a brief moment, but then, without another word, he leaned in and kissed me. It wasn't the tentative peck from before. This was something else entirely. It was deep and passionate, as if all the restraint he had been clinging to had finally snapped. I responded eagerly, my arms wrapping around his neck as I pulled him closer. For a fleeting moment, the outside world faded away. All that existed was Ethan, his hands on my waist, his lips against mine, and the intense heat that had been building between us. When we finally broke apart, we were both gasping for breath, and I could see in his eyes that there was no turning back. "So what's next?" he asked, his voice barely above a whisper. I smiled, taking a step back just enough to give him some space, but not too far away. I think you already know the answer to that, Ethan. We've crossed that line. Why stop now? He didn't reply verbally, nor did he need to. With one last glance at the door, he reached for me once more. This time there was no hesitation, no second-guessing. We were both all in, and retreat was off the table. Let me tell you, that afternoon turned out to be something extraordinary. Far beyond just fixing the bathroom. It was an experience I hadn't felt in ages. As soon as Ethan kissed me, the tension and unspoken desire between us erupted into a fire we couldn't contain. He pulled me close, his hands exploring my back while his lips pressed against mine, more assured and intense than before. I could sense the weight of everything he had been holding back. Initially, we didn't even manage to step out of the bathroom. He gently pushed me against the wall, his hands moving across my shoulders, waist, and hips. His touch was firm yet respectful, as if he was relinquishing control while still trying to tread carefully. But I didn't want him to hold back anymore. I craved this connection just as much as he did. His lips traveled from my mouth to my neck, and I couldn't suppress a soft gasp. He paused, checking to ensure I was comfortable with what was happening. When I didn't stop him, he continued, his kisses becoming more urgent and insistent. It felt like all the time he spent denying this moment had culminated in an irresistible wave. Eventually, though, we had to pause, if only to catch our breath. Pressed together, we both panted as if we had just completed a marathon. His forehead rested against mine, and for a moment, silence enveloped us as we absorbed the reality of what had just occurred. I've never done anything like this, Ethan murmured, his voice low and husky. I shouldn't have. I placed my hand on his chest, feeling his heart race beneath his shirt. There's nothing wrong with letting go sometimes, Ethan. We're adults, we can choose what we want. I smiled softly, trying to alleviate the guilt creeping into his expression. He chuckled nervously, but there was a hint of disbelief in it. You make it sound so easy. It is easy, I insisted, stepping back slightly but keeping my hand on him. You've been holding back. Why? I continued. Is it because of some invisible line between right and wrong? Sometimes you just need to follow what feels good. He remained silent for a moment, studying me with an intense, unreadable gaze. Finally, he exhaled deeply, releasing the tension he had been carrying. I guess I needed to hear that. The rest of the afternoon flew by in a blur. Once we had both calmed down, I led him downstairs to the living room, where we found ourselves talking in a way that felt refreshingly genuine. Our conversation flowed easily, devoid of the awkwardness I had feared. We laughed, shared stories, and learned more about each other. Ethan opened up about his life, explaining how he had been plumbing for nearly a decade after leaving a corporate job he despised. He described how the routine of fixing things provided a sense of comfort and control. That made sense. He seemed like the type who thrived on structure and stability. I shared my own story too, about my marriage, which had ended years ago. I was alone but not bitter. I wasn't the kind of woman who clung to regrets. I had a good life, but I had been missing something for a long time: companionship, passion. I wasn't looking for anything serious, but I needed to feel alive again. And Ethan had ignited that spark within me, even if just for an afternoon. As the sun began to set, I realized he had been here far longer than intended. You should probably head out, I said, even though a part of me wished he would stay. He hesitated, looking torn about leaving. Yeah, I guess I should, but I don't want this to end on an awkward note. I don't want you to think I was just... I shook my head, smiling reassuringly. I don't think that. You're a good man, Ethan. We both needed this, and I'm grateful it happened. But I'm not expecting anything beyond this moment. He looked relieved, but confusion still flickered in his eyes, as if he wasn't used to such clarity. So you're really okay with everything? No weird feelings or anything? I laughed softly. No, Ethan. No weird feelings. It was just one of those moments. No strings, no pressure. He nodded slowly, absorbing the simplicity of it all. Okay, he said after a long pause. I guess I'll see you around. Maybe, I replied, teasing him a little. If my sink breaks again, you'll be the first person I call. That brought a smile to his face as he gathered his tools and slung his bag over his shoulder. Before he left, he turned to me one last time. Lila, I don't regret this. I don't either. I replied softly, watching as he opened the door. And just like that, he was gone. I lingered for a while after he left, reflecting on what had transpired. It was one of those rare moments in life where everything aligned perfectly. No guilt, no shame. Just two people shedding their inhibitions for a while. In the days that followed, I thought about him occasionally, wondering if he thought about me too. But I didn't reach out. I didn't need to. That afternoon had been precisely what it was meant to be, an escape. A reminder that I was still alive, still capable of feeling excitement, desire, and spontaneity. As for Ethan, I hoped he felt the same way. Sometimes, it only takes one unexpected connection to realize that life doesn't have to be confined within rigid boundaries. Maybe he returned to his routine of fixing pipes and moving through his days like always. Or maybe that afternoon gifted him with a fresh perspective. A way to embrace spontaneity when the moment felt right. Regardless of what he took from it, I knew I wouldn't forget him. Perhaps the next time something broke in this house, I'd call him. Or maybe I'd let fate decide. For now, I treasure that little adventure for what it was. Unexpected, beautiful, and a poignant reminder that even at 64, life still holds surprises.